Lewis and Clark described was essentially wall-to-wall fuel across this valley. Now, since settlement, the valley was quickly irrigated. Then we had, of course, domestic grazing. In recent times, we've had heavy development. So the fuels now are very broken up, the fuel landscape. But Lewis and Clark described a fuel landscape that was essentially contiguous. They, in their trek just through what is now Montana, they encountered, George Gould wrote this up in a paper, but it was something like 10 fires burning on the landscape, of which they attributed 8 of them, it's right in that area, 7 or 8 were they attributed to Native American burning.
Is we're just going to do a quick overview in terms of what were the events that were occurring in Fires of 2000, and as sounds like some of you were here, you can probably relive those 14 years ago, kind of what some of the impacts that were happening not only to the Bitterroot Valley residents but also to the firefighters that came and went throughout the course of the summer. It was a pretty interesting scene, but the impact of the fire siege of 2000 was pretty impressive. Of all the fires combined, we had a total of just over 356,000 acres, and we're going to kind of walk through that chronology of events that kind of led up to why it was so bad and how many fires. And like I said, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the fire managers when they get this information, because here you are trying to explain to the public, okay, now what are we going to do, because you just got slapped with a bunch of fires and you don't know where you're starting from and where you're going to end. So if you remember back in 1998, there was a weather phenomenon that was starting to form. It was called La Nina, and it was starting to create some changes in the climate and temperatures and stuff that were going to drastically impact what we call fire season 2000. So through that La Nina building, what we ended up having is by the fall of 1999, we ended up with conditions that were reminiscent of, we had no moisture, our snowpacks were significantly diminished, and again, what was setting itself up 2 years prior to this event was creating conditions to where we didn't recognize it until it actually happened. So had basically lost all their snowpack by February. Our actual snowpack levels that year were only 55 to 70% of normal. And for us, that's unusual, because if you look at the conditions today, we're significantly a lot higher out there, and I know that we'll talk a little bit more in the field. So as we were coming into February, by the end of February, we had already lost all of our snowpack in the valleys. And so live fuel moistures, obviously, they kind of went through a pre-spring green up condition. And so by the time that July arrived, when we started getting the first fires, we were basically a fully cured dead situation, and usually we won't start seeing that until the latter part of July into August. So we were like 3 months way ahead. So our conditions were pretty dire at the time. So the Bitterroot National Forest, up until this time, actually ended up having about, we already had about 115 fires on the forest before the end of July. And for us, we average anywhere from 135 to 165 fires a year, which is actually quite a bit. Most of that is from lightning. And then this is no different. So how does it all begin? You are in fire season. Guess what? We have a lot of lightning. A lot of lightning tracks basically from southwest to northeast through these valleys. And so you'll see storms develop over the Selway and the Sandwich House and Payette, and it'll track right over and then move to the northeast. So that's kind of how the series of storms is going to come in and start. So you are now looking at July 31st on this map, and I don't know why it says 92. But they basically ended up mapping, like I said, the forest had about 115 starts already. Guess what? Your lightning storm just laid down 78 new strikes. So as of the end of 2000 into 2001, total cost of the fires of 2000 was $85,640,000 $4.25. This was before the burned area emergency rehabilitation stuff had kicked in, which I think was pushing it towards another $50 million is what I kept hearing about. So again, this is kind of now your issue. Again, how would you address the public? What concerns would you be looking at? You had a whole entire valley impacted by the series of events that materialized at 2000. And then you have to deal with the aftermath of what comes next is recovering. How do you get there? And to prepare for the next round of fires that probably will come.
Have you all heard of this resolution that Wilson Park County and Broadwater County and Jefferson County have come up with? Anybody has heard of that resolution?
Yeah. Oh, cool.
It started with that Yarnell fire. My wife and I were listening to the radio and some of the reports from that, and she turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, you know, we lost 19 good men for sticks and bricks. And I thought, you know, that's enough. Enough is enough. And I wrote a paper, titled that, and it was picked up pretty much by the Fire Safe Montana. I developed I put together a three-pronged approach to that and presented it to the Lewis and Clark Rural Fire Council, of which one of our county commissioners is a member. And he took that and took it to the county commission and unanimously put together this resolution and unanimously approved it. Since then we have the similar resolution approved unanimously by Broadwater County and Jefferson County. Looks like the city of Helena is going to do the same thing right soon.
Just one variation on the resolution that I've heard somebody make. I think Bob Much was one of them. But it is when addressing residents of the wildland urban interface, and they're wondering, well, gee, do I really need to do anything to my place? You know, somebody says, well, lay a little guilt trip on them. You know, your place, if somebody comes in here to protect it, they're risking their lives. How would you feel about having one or two or more firefighters die trying to protect your place? And we can't guarantee that won't happen if you don't clean it up, because, you know, yeah, the regulation is, yeah, they're not supposed to be coming in here because you have such a narrow road and you haven't done anything. But they might come in here anyhow to try to protect your place, and they might die. How are you going to feel about that? You know, I mean, I think we need to lay it on some of these reluctant people a little harder.
And I can tell you that's worked in my community. Because our people are saying, no, we haven't cleaned it up, don't go in there. In fact, we're going to put a tree across the road so nobody can get in there until we do get it cleaned up. So they are very conscious of the firefighters.
Okay.
So I decided to build my cabin so it would be fire safe, and I had shale landscaping instead of bark mulch, and I put on a metal roof to keep the embers from burning a shake roof down when a fire comes, and I put my propane tank over 50 feet away from my place to keep it out of harm's way. And I guess I also put on a Trex deck.
And you've cleared so much around here. The thinning here has been tremendous. Granted, you had to do it because of the beetle kill, but you're not going to get the ferocity of fire in here that normally you would have seen. As a firefighter, you know, as a fire officer, I would not have a problem with sending a crew in here to babysit this. You've done the work, and all they have to do is make sure that the little things that happen, a little ember that falls on a little bit of litter near the house that starts a little bit of flame, they'll be here. But I feel good about leaving them here because they're not in danger. They can handle this. This is safe for them.
Yeah, you brought up a really interesting point. We used to call it defensible space, but after fires like Yarnell and others, we know that what it really permits for the firefighter is survivable space. That if the firefighter is here, that the space is actually survivable by a human being, in addition to providing a safe kind of fire behavior scenario where they can effectively fight fire. I tell you what I learned in 2012 when our district was threatened by the Mustang fire, Alan, that 350,000 acre fire that came at us out of the Salmon River. And what I realized then, as I started looking around my property again in the middle of the fire season, you're never done preparing. it's a work in progress, and I did a little more weed whacking, and I looked up on my roof and realized even though it's a metal roof, there were a lot of pine needles up there, so I got the pine needles off the roof, and it's just the constant maintenance and upkeep kind of mentality to keep you out of harm's way.
It's some people, you guys are probably, I read in the Missoulian something about, somebody was saying that this is a people issue. Yeah, it's a people issue. If nobody lived around here, nobody cared. You let it burn, it comes back, you do your thing. People are the answer to this. And that's what Australia found out with their Prepare, Stay, Go Early, Stay and Defend program. You got to get all your resources working for you. In our case, we adopted that program, but then we had Fire Safe Montana. Okay, and there was a group of 10 or 12 of us who kind of got that thing going. And that's all about how do you build appropriately for living in the WUI? How do you clear your property? How do you use the right construction materials so that fire doesn't want to burn? It doesn't want to take out houses left and right. There is one critical thing. Bruce Sunram, he's a guy who's done a lot of fire stuff in the state. He and I did presentations a couple years ago. And basically he described the Australian program when he was talking about Ready, Set, Go. Except for one thing. Ready, Set, Go waits too long to say it's time to evacuate. And it's a critical error that's going to get people hurt. Load up.
So, after the fire, what goes away is the one single component that is holding the place together, and that's the vegetation. Because of these deeply weathered soils and granitic origin, we've got a situation where once you remove this, and if it's a higher than normal severity fire, you're going to get more of that than you would in a historical regime where you had spotty fires all the time. You're setting yourself up for a large percentage of any given watershed being denuded, being taken down to granitic soil. While that happens, you're removing the sponge that lays on top of the ground. You're removing the organic soil cover. And we saw this, we've seen this in almost any vegetation type, in that the soils, once you pull that ground cover off, it loses its protection from rain splash. It loses a frictional component that inhibits high-speed surface flow, high-velocity flow, and it ends up leading to concentration of flows. And what you get right across from us is one of the gullies that formed here in Rye Creek. We call them debris flows. Most of the debris flows that happen in these post-fire situations occur 15 minutes, 30 minutes long, and they're done. But they've moved literally thousands and thousands of cubic yards of material in 15 minutes in any given drainage. And because these things have been going on for so long, this whole routine is natural, except for the high severity part, which I can talk about a little bit more. We build up these fans at the bottom, which is that V-shaped situation over there where it's kind of filled in, it's a little bit less steep, and the gully will cut a channel one side or the other in that. In fact, Karen pointed out there's 2 channels in that one. So alluvial fans are a natural phenomena. The stream will cut against the bottom of it over time and remove that material, send it downriver.
So I want to go back to the debris flows
Go
for
ahead.
just a second, just because I studied these for my dissertation.
Yes,
so
let's hear about
I think
it.
they're kind of cool, and Ed did a really good job, so I don't really have much to add. But one of the things that I think is kind of cool to realize about them is in these kind of areas, they are responsible for most of the erosion. So there's some studies indicating that the amount of sediment that's going out daily in the stream is about order of magnitude 10 times less than what gets delivered in these episodic events. So they're these debris flows are the major driver of topography here in a lot of ways. And after you've walked around on enough of these debris flow pans, you start to notice how they form the stream course in a lot of instances, especially where we've seen a lot of them recently. The stream is making its way around the toe of all of these debris flow fans. And another thing I realized after walking around on them for a while, and I don't want to get into Mike's topic at all, but people regard these kind of like fire, as in this is a disaster, this is not a good event, this is a bad thing for the watershed. And maybe that is true in the short term, but you also realize that it is bringing down the larger rocks that we know are good for fish now. And then when you have a fire on top of that, it's delivering large woody debris to the stream.
This is a trout fishery, okay? It's a cold water fishery and it's recreational. There's no commercial fishery here. And we're generally talking small trout, less than 10 inches long. We have 2 native species on the Bitterroot Forest. The West Slope cutthroat trout, which is our state fish, and the bull trout, which is a ESA, Endangered Species Act, threatened species. Generally, West Slope cutthroat trout are pretty common on the forest. Like in North Rye Creek, 99% of the fish in North Rye Creek right behind you are West Slope cutthroat trout. Bull trout are not present in this drainage. They may have, decades ago been here. We have no record of them being in North Rye, but they're less common on the forest. Right after the fires, we had an opportunity here. We got approached by a grad student at Montana State University who wanted to do a post-fire fish recovery project. And the reason they came here was A, we had a lot of burn streams, and B, we also had a very good pre-fire database of mark recapture population estimates in many streams across the forest. So it would make for a good comparison study. Okay, there were 3 main questions that he was asking. He said, did our damaged native populations, the West Slope cutthroat trout and the bull trout, recover? And what he found was yes. Most of our population, this really surprised us, most of our populations approached or exceeded pre-fire abundance levels by the 3rd year of a study after fire. We weren't expecting that. The second question was kind of what we were expecting. Did brook trout increase in the burned streams and did they displace the natives? And the answer was, in most of the streams, it was surprisingly no. It was actually suppressed. In fact, the brook trout got knocked way back, and in a lot of these burned streams, like North Rye Creek, they still have a presence, but it's nowhere near what it was prior to 2000. And then the last question was, did we see invasions of non-natives? Did they come into streams where they weren't there before the fires? And the answer was yes. We found non-natives for the first time in 7 of the 30 streams. What was surprising was the non-native that we found most of the time was a brown trout. That was 5 of those 7. And we only found brook trout and rainbows show up in 1 site. And the number of, the positive thing was the number of the invaders was low. It was usually 1 or 2 fish. We never saw them in any sizable numbers, too. Laird Creek was burned at high severity, tons of debris flows, killed almost all the fish in the stream. That's what's interesting about this. Not in any single stream did every single fish die, no matter how hard it got burned. There were some 1,000-foot sections where we only found 1 or 2 survivors, but there were always some survivors. And wherever there were little unburned green islands, usually the numbers were pretty good when you went into those areas. So there's internal refuges within the stream corridor during a fire. These fish can be extirpated, but the West Slope cutthroat trout is a fire-adapted species that's pretty darn tough because there's not a lot of habitat to go run and hide here. They had to come back on this burned site.
Yeah, they went and looked at the carcasses and they looked at all the chew marks.
Yeah, and how whether they eat it in place or scatter. But yeah, so they also work with
Friends of the Bitterroot is a genuinely grassroots organization, about 26 years old, and it's non-hierarchical. We make decisions with a steering committee of 8 to 12 people, and our membership has been Well, we're over 300 now. We basically decided that we would stick to good science, best available science, that we're not opposed to logging per se, and that we would use the available process that's provided by NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, to do what we could to keep forest management kind of on track. And I believe we've been making some headway simply through doing our homework, offering comments to the draft and scoping. And I think that it took a while, but I think to actually make an impact on the Forest Service project, you need to not only have your facts right, but you need to have a credible threat of litigation. And once you satisfy those two requirements, then you can start getting them to modify projects, prior to the need of going to court. And we've been called all kinds of names, but a common one is that we're called obstructionists, and we don't see it that way. We believe we serve the role of a guardrail, which I guess obstructs vehicles from going into the canyon, and it protects lives, and that's what we see our role as being. If we were obstructionists, we would have been appealing and litigating everything that came our way, but